My name is Morgan Young. I'm interviewing Nan Heim for the Oregon State Capitol Foundation Oral History Project. It is January 28th, 2025, and we're in Portland, Oregon. Thanks for being with us this afternoon, letting
Thank you.
us take over your home. I want to start with your early life, and it's my understanding you grew up in a political family in Washington, D.C. So tell me a bit about that.
I did. My father had grown up wanting to be a small-town lawyer, and as he always said, until he became one. And that wasn't enough for him. He got a job with the legal department of the Secretary of the Army, and we left our small town in Minnesota and moved to the Washington, D.C. area. And he did that for a couple of years, and then he got an appointment under President Eisenhower to head a bureau at the Federal Trade Commission. And so we were there for 9 years, from when I was just turned 7 till I turned 16. So I really grew up there. We lived outside of Washington in a log cabin, an old log cabin, tiny little place on acres with an old stables, and it was a wonderful place to grow up. And my parents were both very active in politics. My mother in particular was president of the Northern Virginia Republican Women, but it was a very different Republican Party in those days. And Virginia Democrats were sometimes called Dixiecrats or Byrd Democrats, led by Senator Harry Byrd. My parents were very supportive, for example, of school integration. I remember as a little girl, they drove me out in the country to show me the ramshackle, falling down schoolhouse where black children were sent in our county, and explaining to me why that was wrong. And then watching TV with my father when Eisenhower sent the federal troops to Arkansas to protect the children, the black children getting into school, and explaining to me why that was the right thing and why it had to be done. So I grew up with that, and it influences me to this day.
When did you get involved in politics?
Well, from an early age, really. Growing up in Virginia, we all were probably more interested in politics than if we had lived elsewhere. You were very aware of it. My parents took me down to watch the Senate in session, for example, and then they were involved in various campaigns. So I was always paying attention. But I didn't really get involved until I started working on Capitol Hill.
So you were in the D.C. area until you were 16.
And we moved back to Minnesota.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And you graduated high school, you went to college.
Yes.
And so how did you wind back up in D.C. working on Capitol Hill?
I had intended to be a history teacher, and I wanted to teach in Washington, D.C., but there were no openings at the time I applied. And so I thought, I'll go get a job on Capitol Hill and I'll keep an eye out for openings. So I went, and if you were a woman applying for a job on Capitol Hill in a congressional staff, you had to take the typing test. It didn't matter what education you had, whatever. Men didn't have to take it, women did. As it happened, I was a really good typist, so I had several offers. But I really liked Congressman John Dellenback from Oregon. He was energetic, enthusiastic. He was what we called then a Rockefeller Republican, very moderate. And I just liked the idea of learning about a new state where I had never been. I don't think I'd been west of the Mississippi. So it was very exciting. I really enjoyed going to work for him. Knew nothing whatsoever about Oregon.
I was just going to ask.
When I started. But the first week on the job, I found in the bookcase an Oregon Blue Book, which is still, of course, published today. And I took it home, and I read it cover to cover. And I kind of became the resident expert on strange things like where's Garibaldi? Whose district is that? And I knew. So it was a wonderful learning experience, and he was a terrific boss.
When was the first time you actually went to Oregon?
I'm not sure I remember the year.
Well, that's okay, but
eventually I became press secretary. I started out as legislative assistant for his education committee work. And then I really wanted to be the press secretary. And the press secretary left, and I got that job and came out here to meet the newspaper editors and reporters. In those days, there were something like 29 newspapers in the 4th District that he represented. I'm sure there are fewer than a quarter now. But it was a wonderful experience traveling around, meeting newspaper editors and reporters. I loved it.
Do you remember your first impressions of coming to the state? I mean...
Oh, yes. It seemed so uncrowded, a little bit rustic, beautiful. Never thought I would live here, ever. But I loved being here. And I stayed. At one time, he had me manage his district office. And so I stayed here for 3 months. And when I left, all my friends came to see me off, and I thought I didn't know if I'd ever be back, because Dellenback had just lost his race for re-election. This was after I worked for him for 6 years. So they threw me a goodbye party, and I came back a month later to interview for another job.
So tell me about that. This is for the State Department of Education?
Yes. On the campaign trail, Congressman Dellenback had met Verne Duncan, who was running for State Superintendent of Public Instruction, which used to be an elected position. And when Dellenback lost, he called Verne and said, "You need to hire Nan Heim, who is my press secretary and did my education legislative work as well." So I was back in D.C. by then, interviewing for jobs on the Hill, and just not feeling excited about it. And then I interviewed for a job in the Congressional Relations Office of what was then the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And you had to have FBI clearance, security clearance. And that was taking forever and ever and ever. So I came out here to interview for the job, and I thought, well, that would be exciting to do for a few years, and then I'll go back to D.C. But of course, I ended up taking the job and moving here. And then about 4 months later, I got word from HEW that the job was ready for me. I said, well, sorry, no thanks.
So I think this was about 1974 when you...
75.
75. Mm-hmm. And then you moved to Salem?
I moved to Salem, and that was kind of a shock for somebody who had lived in D.C. for years. Lived in a city almost always. Mm-hmm. I mean, the department was an interesting place to work. I loved the job, and I'm very fond of Verne Duncan. He's still a very good friend of mine. But I think I wasn't really cut out for working in a big bureaucracy. I was used to the congressional office where you didn't, you just had to go to the boss and say, here's what I'd like you to do, or how do you want me to handle this? But in a bureaucracy, there are layers. I would have hated the job at HEW in D.C., so it's just as well. So I worked for Verne at the department for a couple of years, 2 years.
And then I believe you started working for a lobbying firm? Or was there another
Yeah, well, I did some contracting for a while.
Okay.
But I think I didn't really know enough people, I couldn't build a big enough business. And I went to work for Roger Martin, the late Roger Martin, who was starting his own lobbying firm. And that was exciting. We were interviewing for clients, building the business. I just had lunch the other day with the man who was the lobbyist for TriMet. And he and Roger and I organized the Oregon Transit Association. And that was really very exciting. And I loved that job too. Great respect for Roger. I miss him terribly. He died a couple years ago. But I decided I wanted to go out on my own. And I just wanted to, I guess, prove something to myself. So I started my own business pretty naively. I wish I could show you my business plan that I found the other day. I wrote it out on, I had already recruited a couple of clients. So I knew how much my initial income would be. And I had hired for 1 day a week a woman I had met at TriMet who was a lawyer, very brilliant lawyer. And she had kids. She didn't want to work full time. So I said, well, come work for me 1 day a week, and we'll see what happens. And she ended up working for me for 15 years, full time. But so my business plan, I wrote down the money I was going to get from these first clients, and it was like, I don't know, $600 a month. So then I was paying Jody, I was paying an office manager, and I was paying rent. Oh no, the $600 a month was what was left for me. So I wrote all this down, and then at the end, when I put down $600 remaining, I put, not enough for me. So I didn't know what I was doing, but it was exciting and great fun.
Were there other women working for lobbying firms or running their own lobbying firms at the time?
There were certainly other women lobbyists, not a lot, but there weren't any women running their own lobbying firms. I just plunged in.
Did you always call it Nan Heim Associates from the beginning?
I did. A friend who had a lobbying firm, a polling firm, was the one who urged me to do that. He said, you're going to meet people, and you're going to meet legislators and other lobbyists, and you don't want them to have to remember your name and some other totally unrelated name, like public affairs or whatever. So just call it after your name. That makes it easier. So I did. It didn't really have to do with ego. It was a practical move.
But I also like the "and associates" because, gives room for growth.
True. And luckily it did.
So can you tell me a bit about some of these clients that you had initially?
My first two clients were the Oregon State Ambulance Association and the Oregon Library Association. And they both stayed with me for 43 plus years, the whole time I lobbied. Wonderful, wonderful clients. Very passionate about their professions.
And I would imagine you have to develop expertise in a lot of different industries if you work for a lobbying firm.
Yes, but you also have to be willing to say, I'm not a librarian, but I can get that answer for you, because you don't want to get out ahead of yourself. And so I was never afraid to say that.
So you were also involved in association management, is my understanding, that you started doing that work too. So tell me a little bit about how that evolved.
That evolved from another lobbyist who had been, his firm had been lobbying and doing association management for the Oregon Academy of Ophthalmology. And that's the ophthalmologists, obviously. And he had decided to go in a different direction, and he referred them to me. And so they wanted us to do association management. And luckily I had a wonderful person on staff who was very good at that. When you have an association of doctors, you put on their continuing medical education conferences every year. And that is a lot of work. You recruit speakers from around the country. You go to an accrediting agency to make sure that you're giving the right professional information. And so I had a wonderful assistant who worked for me for 15 years doing that. And then a second one who worked for another 10 or 15.
About how long do you think you had your firm before you started adding the association management?
Oh, probably about 7 years.
Okay. So the first 7 was really focused on your work as a lobbyist.
Yes. I take that back. Well, the Oregon State Ambulance Association I also managed from the very beginning.
Oh, okay.
But I didn't think of them because they didn't have the same conference requirements. We had 4 quarterly meetings with them and managed their association too, but didn't do the same level of conference.
I would imagine that the experience you gained working for the Congressman on Capitol Hill and then working for the Department of Education all helped in your career as a lobbyist, and then, of course, working with Roger Martin.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. Because you learn I was very fortunate in my bosses, in John Dellenback, in Roger Martin, in Verne Duncan, because they all knew the value of bringing people together. They were all moderate in their politics. Verne is the only one who's still here, and he is very moderate too. He actually is not a Republican anymore. but they all understood that you have to bring people together to get where you want to go. Roger Martin used to give dinners all the time. And that when I first went to work for him and he was putting together the first dinner, and he showed me the guest list, and I said, Roger, you have probably the most liberal Democrat from Portland, and then you've invited this incredibly conservative Republican from Southern Oregon. How's that going to be? And he said, it's going to be great. I said, but they don't have anything in common. And he said, well, sure they do. They're both legislators, and then they will both have had dinner with us. And that was always his strategy, to bring people together, and that was true of all my bosses.
How did you grow your business from your initial clients?
I never had to do any marketing. People would refer, legislators mostly would refer. Somebody who's an association or a group or whatever looking for a lobbyist tends to ask a legislator. And almost, I think all my clients came from legislative referrals.
So would you, when the legislature was in session, would you be spending time in the Oregon State Capitol?
Almost every day.
So talk to me what that's like. What is an average day for a lobbyist when the legislature is in session?
An average day for me is I would get there by 7 a.m. and go in and get the schedule for the day. I mean, most of the time you knew ahead of time what you had. There were always 8 a.m. hearings, and if there's a hearing that affected my clients, then I would go to that. If I were testifying, I would be testifying. The House and Senate would go into session. There would be hearings from 8 to 10, and then there would be a session. And that's when almost everybody went down and drank coffee in the coffee shop. And you picked up all the news, all that was going on. And then there would be hearings again all afternoon. And in between, you would have appointments to meet with individual legislators. When you had a bill in a committee, you would try to meet with every member of that committee before the hearing. So you had a good idea what you needed to address in your testimony.
How did things change for lobbyists, or did they over time during your career?
I don't think the basics changed that much, except it became much more crowded. Much more crowded. Many more lobbyists, more staff. And so it was a little bit harder to maneuver and make sure you saw everybody you needed to see, just because there were so many more lobbyists.
And it's my understanding in talking to folks like Frankie Bell and Herb Collum that you could just walk into the Capitol. There wasn't security, it was...
That's right. That's one of the saddest things, I think.
Yeah. Were you ever using those phone booths? I love those.
I love
wooden-
the phone booths. I'm really sorry they're gone. I hope they keep one for historic purposes, but they probably won't. Yes, it was very different.
Do you have memories of your first time going into the Capitol?
Yes, Verne Duncan took me around and introduced me to the leaders of the House and Senate. And I was very impressed by the rotunda. But of course, when I had worked on Capitol Hill in D.C., you could just walk into the Capitol and go wherever you wanted, whenever you wanted. There wasn't anything like the security they now have. I think it's sad, really, for public access. It's just so hard to get in now.
It's a very different aesthetic, the U.S. Capitol versus the Oregon Capitol.
Very.
Built in the 1930s in its Art Deco style.
Very. And I love history, so I used to give tours when people would come from Oregon to see John Dellenback. He would have me take them to the U.S. Capitol and give them a tour. And you didn't have to notify anybody that you were doing it. You just walked over and walked through wherever you wanted to go.
Well, with your firm, you also then started doing campaign management, right?
I did a little. In the 80s, and really somewhat in the 90s, there were not annual sessions for quite a while. And so in between, sometimes I kind of got onto that right away and didn't run into this problem, but sometimes clients just wanted to hire you for the session. Well, that gave you a year and a half of, they would pay you for the session, and then you didn't have them for a year and a half. And that was not all that uncommon. And so that you kind of could fill the gap with campaign management.
Did you have an avenue that you started liking more of the lobbying, association management, campaign management?
It depended on the campaign. One of my best campaigns was there was a measure put on the ballot, I believe by initiative petition, to repeal Oregon's land use law. And I was hired to manage the campaign to save the land use law, to get a no on the measure. And that was a good experience. I got to work with Governor Vicatia. He chaired, it was a bipartisan committee, and the governor was the chair. And the argument, you always have a poll done first, a survey of voters, to find out which arguments are the most compelling. And it was farmland, protect farmland, worked with urban voters as well. And it was just a great experience. And we won, which always means it's a great experience.
I want to talk about memories you might have of particular legislative sessions that stick out in your mind, if you have any of.
Particular legislative sessions. Certainly the session where the House was tied and there were co-speakers.
Bruce Hanna and Arnie Roblin.
Yes, that was just so interesting because it was cooperative. And you knew it was a different strategy, very different strategy. You had to have it worked out, but they would help you work it out because that's what they wanted. They wanted cooperation, and they got it, but it was certainly very different. I'd love to see it happen again, but I don't know that it ever will. We'll see.
You never know, right?
You never know.
Yeah. And so when you're working as a lobbyist, do you yourself have to come across as or take a bipartisan stance, or does it depend on the issue in which you're discussing?
It depends on the issue, but I almost always tried for a bipartisan effort.
And so you had mentioned ambulance, libraries, and what are some other industries that you were involved in?
Well, I represented the ophthalmologists, Statewide Ophthalmology Association, Statewide Orthopedic Association. There is one session where we lobbied for a gay rights coalition. And that was a particularly fascinating experience.
Would that have been in maybe the 80s
Early
or
90s, early 90s.
Oh, so is this coming in response to Oregon Citizens Alliance and their
Yes.
work with ballot measure
Yes.
9?
It was right after a measure was defeated.
Right.
But there was an effort by local cities and counties to have their version of the measure that was defeated.
Right.
And when we got to the Capitol and started lobbying on that, well, we lobbied ahead of time, but we met with a wonderful, very moderate Republican. The House was Republican, under Republican control that session. And the moderate Republican from Klamath Falls, Del Parks, said, "You're not going to get a big, huge bill. But what we can get," he said, "I believe we can get a bill that invalidates these local anti-gay measures. And that would be a big step forward to get what you want eventually." And he was wonderful. He was the chair of the Judiciary Committee, and he got together his moderate, we had most of the Democrats, almost all of them, and he got together a group of 6 or 7 moderate Republicans in the House, and we got the bill through the House, and then when it got to the Senate, Lon Mabon was really causing an uproar. He threatened to start recall movements against several of the Republicans and even a couple of the Democrats who were supporting our bill. And I will always remember he was up in the gallery watching as the Senate debated and voted on the bill. And a Republican from Jackson County, Senator Len Hannon, stood up and he talked about his childhood. His father was a minister. And I think probably a kind of fundamentalist. But Len said, Senator Hannon said, he raised us to love people, to love our fellow people. And I do. And I will support this bill proudly. I get chills thinking about it. He looked up at the gallery where Lon Mabon and the TV cameras were. Lon Mabon was leaning over, glaring at everybody. And he said, "And I understand there's someone here who wants to launch a recall movement against me for my vote. And I want to say to him, go ahead and make my day." It was fabulous. And we won.
Wow. Yeah, I think the average maybe resident in Oregon doesn't realize how exciting the activities within the Capitol can be.
That was one of the more exciting ones. It really was.
I want to shift gears for a second and talk about the Oregon State Capitol Foundation, because your former boss was the one who introduced the legislation that established that.
He established it in law, yes.
In law,
it had
yes.
gotten started a little bit before that, and he'd been active in it, so he put that bill in.
And you've been active with the foundation, have you not?
Yes, for about 7 years now. Wow. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Frankie Bell has described it to me as sort of being like an opportunity for people to get together at the initial concept of like college alumni, for people who worked in and around the Capitol.
And that is one thing we do, and when I joined and I saw our contact list, I was, we can magnify this many times. All we have to do is find people. So that's what several of us worked on for the first months I was on. It was relatively easy to find former legislators because they tend to live in the same areas that they represented. It was a little bit harder, and still is, to find former lobbyists because you don't know where they are. But we used a lot of white pages and found people and asked around. And
So you were looking for former legislators, would have been staffers as well?
yes, former staffers, they're hard to find too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
lobbyists, what about like facilities staff or the folks who are working there year round?
Yes. And people, now we've expanded it and tried to find, and are trying to find people in state agencies who had, maybe weren't there very often, but had some interest in being part of the Capitol, and certainly were affected by what happened in the Capitol.
Yeah, so both legislative and executive branch folks?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Do you have a favorite? So you mentioned the rotunda in the Capitol. Do you have other favorite parts of it?
I love that whole building. I loved watching from the gallery. I always tried to watch when certain legislators were speaking, like the late, great Senator Peter Courtney was a fabulous orator, and I loved listening and watching when he spoke. Unfortunately, with the sad fading away of media coverage, there just aren't the same number of speeches that there used to be, because there used to be desks for the reporters right on the floor of the House and Senate, and there was TV coverage many days, and there isn't anymore. So there's just not as much, frankly, great public speaking.
Well, if you came to Oregon in 1975, right, to live?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So then you came before the wings were added on to the Capitol.
Yes, right before.
Right before.
Right before.
And then you were there. I'm trying to think of major things that happened in the Capitol beyond legislation. The spring break quake.
Oh, yes, the spring break quake. Yes.
In 1993, and then now the CAMS project will really change that.
Yes.
It's
exciting.
It's very exciting. Where was the coffee shop? Was that in the basement?
That was in the basement. And when I started, and for quite a few years after that, there was smoking. And of course, it has no windows. It has only one door. So it was a fairly smoky place. Well, the whole building was.
Yeah, and I would imagine that there might have been some not great alterations from the 70s and 80s, as there tend to be in historic buildings.
Not so much, really. I think there's always been, particularly among legislators who tend to respect and love the building. So there really haven't been that many unfortunate cosmetic changes that I could think of. And I'm very excited to see what comes next, what we have next.
I know it's going to be one of the most seismically sound buildings in the state.
It should be.
Yeah. So how long did you run Nan Heim Associates?
I just counted that up the other day. I think it was 35 years. 35, right around there.
And were you based in Portland the whole time?
Yes. I had a wonderful office right across the street from the main downtown library.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Like where the Virginia Cafe is? Like across which street? The 10th, Taylor, 11th?
It was on the corner of Taylor and 11th.
Okay.
It's an old medical building.
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Built in the 20s.
Okay.
I wanted an old building.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I also love that a lot of the connective thread is that you were working in healthcare associated organizations.
Yes,
To
and
be in
across the
old-
street from the library.
Yeah,
And
there
I
you
had
go.
lobbied, when I lobbied for TriMet to get light rail funding, so that's part of downtown. And
Totally.
yeah, I wanted to be downtown.
What do you remember? So working on transit projects, That just, to me, it's so iconically Portland, all of the great transit we have.
We lobbied in the 80s, late 70s or early 80s, for the state share of the initial light rail from Gresham to downtown. And that was a very interesting experience because it was such a totally new concept for, I mean, it wasn't really because there had been streetcars, but that was so in the past. And it seemed very expensive to many legislators, and it was kind of, who knows if anybody will ever ride it. You know, you're going to build this brand new thing, and who knows if it's going to succeed. It was exciting to lobby for it, and then, of course, to win.
So when you were working on issues, I mean, you would lobby at the state level. Would you also need to lobby at the municipal level?
I did not do that. I was not under contract to do that.
Okay.
I just lobbied at the state level.
Do you have any memories of people you've worked with or who've worked for you over the years? You mentioned that there were some folks who stayed with you 15 plus years.
Oh, yes, yes. Yeah, Jody Daniels she's the lawyer whom I hired right away, and she stayed with me 15 years, and it was wonderful. Very brilliant woman, and she lobbied with me, and is still a very dear friend. And then I had two people who did the association work in terms of quarterly meetings and the medical conferences. One, Liz Anderson, worked for me probably at least 15 years, and then Diane Mayer, so they succeeded her. And they were both wonderful at their jobs.
So putting on woman-owned firm hiring women.
I hired one man, and he was terrific. He was great. Other than that, it was always women. And that was intentional.
When did you decide to retire?
I retired at the end of 2017 with very mixed feelings, but you know, it becomes a challenging job physically because you're on your feet a lot, and we call it, I can't even think of the official name when you get the pain up your calf from your heel. There's a medical name for it, but we call it the lobbyist curse. And I was talking to one of the orthopedists about it, and he said, well, what causes it is if you move differently a lot, if you are kind of running on hard surface, and then you stop, and maybe you sit for a while, and then you walk, and then you run again, and then you sit. And I said, oh, that's what we do all day. So I wish I could think of the name of that. Or maybe
and not in sneakers, I would imagine. You're in having to wear.
When I was young, I wore high heels. They got flatter and flatter over the years, and eventually totally flat. But I didn't ever wear sneakers, actually.
Yeah, I would imagine that probably wouldn't be looked highly upon in the.
Maybe now it would be, but not then.
So what did you do in retirement? I mean, you joined the board of the foundation in 2017. Is what my notes say.
Yes, what I did. My sister in Virginia was very ill, and so the first and second year of my retirement, I spent a good deal of time in Richmond, Virginia, with her.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you've been in the same home for.
Here, yes, for years.
For years.
Yes, and that same year, the first year of my retirement, my parents had a big old house in Minnesota on a lake, and we had all gone there every summer for years and years and years, and we kept it after they died. We kept it for another 15 years, and it was time to sell it. So I spent a good deal of time cleaning out this huge old house and selling things and getting rid of things. So that was my retirement years, the first couple of years.
Did you continue to pay attention to what was going on in the Capitol?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I sold my business to this wonderful, brilliant woman, Amanda Dalton, who's a lawyer. And she had, she likes to say she stalked me for 2 years. And I knew what she wanted, so I used to avoid her because I just wasn't sure I was ready to retire. But she had a wonderful proposal to buy my business, and she did. And she's been terrific. She's done a terrific job. My clients, my former clients, really love working with her, so it's worked out beautifully.
Did she keep the name, or did she rename the business?
No, it's called Dalton Advocacy. But I'm on her website. It's fun to look. She has a little story about me, and we have a great relationship. She's a good friend.
What was the year that you started your company? Do you remember?
I started on my own in 1982 and sold my business.
2017?
Yeah, I think the first payment was in 2018.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it turned 40 not too long ago.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, incredible. So you've been closely associated with the Oregon State Capitol. You've worked in it as a lobbyist, and then you worked with the foundation. Why is the building and the people connected with it, why are they so important?
Well, I think because state government is so important, and it affects all of us. It affects everybody in the state. And I think I have great respect for the legislative process that occurs in that building. And there are so many interesting, smart people. I loved, from the day I started there, I loved meeting the incredible variety of people who work there, from all kinds of backgrounds: teaching, farming, business, fishing, all kinds. And it was fascinating to me. And they're there because they care about the state and the people in the state. Of course, there are those who have ambitions to move on to other political offices. But the majority, the vast majority, are there because they care about Oregonians.
Well, I think comparing your experiences working with the U.S. legislature, which that could be your career if you become an elected official, if you're a congressman, versus the citizen legislature in Oregon. Most folks are needing to maintain another job, and so they're coming as farmers and as
Right. Mm-hmm.
bringing their own experience.
I think the thing I loved most about my entire lobbying career was the people from all walks of life. Meeting my clients, the legislators, the legislative staffers, all these people who care about life in Oregon and what happens.
Did you notice the legislature change over the course of your career? That's something I asked Frankie Bell about. Then more women became elected, more people of color became elected, younger people might have been elected.
Yes, it has changed a lot, and I can't really speak for the last few years, but fundamentally, again, I think it's people who care about other Oregonians. And I don't think fundamentally that's changed.
Can you believe that you're still here? Still living in Oregon?
Sometimes I do find it a little overwhelming.
Since you mentioned that you thought you'd only come for a couple years, and
then I would go home. I would go home. Yeah, then I never did. Yeah, and all my family still live in the East.
Yeah, the one thing that just crossed my mind is that not only were you coming from working for the federal government versus state government, but the difference in working in the East Coast versus the West Coast. It's a different pace.
Very different pace. A very different pace. I noticed right away In Washington, working on the Hill in particular, there was such competitiveness. I mean, people would compete about everything. So your commute is 25 minutes, I get to the Capitol in 15. And that includes parking. I mean, you would hear things like that all the time. My congressman is the ranking member of this committee, and yours is only on that silly old committee. I mean, it's just very, very competitive. It gets a little boring, frankly.
Yeah. You can also feel it, I think, in the atmosphere when you go to DC, the competitive edge.
Yes. And I'm a competitive person. Just ask my nephew. I just finished playing cribbage with him when he visited me. Yeah. He'll say, "Oh, Nan is so competitive."
Well, those are the main questions I had. Is there anything else that you want to make sure we talk about over your long career in Oregon?
I don't think so. I'm very grateful to have had this career. It was a wonderful experience. And again, it was the people. The people, my clients who cared so passionately about what they do. Ambulances saving lives, that's what they care about. It was an honor to work with all of my clients.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.